Hello, this is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and I'm here for a new edition of the Jewish Contrarians podcast with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shafatinsky. Hi, Brandy.
How's it going, David?
I'm good, thank you. We are here today to offer some contrarian commentary on the White House's newly minted strategy to fight anti-Semitism. Now, in a reversal of fortunes, it may be Brandy who goes on an epic rant today. I'm not sure about this. I'll just offer a couple of thoughts. One is that I think it's a good thing that the White House got fully engaged in this and that it offers a point of leverage. And second thing is that I think that there are some problems and gaps in it. And so thank you, Dan, for putting up a picture of what the cover looks like of the strategy. You can't see that if you're just on audio, but it's a nice blue cover. Brandy, so why don't I just start with you? What do you think some of the flaws are in this U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism? What do you think is wrong with the document?
I want to start by saying I think that it's a bold move for the White House to actually admit that there's an issue going on, acknowledge that there's something happening with the increase in anti-Semitism we're seeing all across the country, and put forth something that they believe will counter it. The concerns I have are, one, I think in order to counter something, you have to be able to effectively define it. And the strategy includes the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, but it also references another more watered down definition of anti-Semitism. And the bigger question I have is, why offer a watered down definition if your stance is actually to counter anti-Semitism? The bigger issue that I have is that some of the partners listed actively engage in fomenting anti-Semitism. So I don't know why they would be included in a strategy to counter it. And I think
what would one of those partners be?
CARE. I mean, I think that's, different chapters across the country have had their leadership and members spew the most horrific anti-Semitic tropes and rhetoric. And this isn't something, they did this years past and have kind of changed. They continue to do so. They have no business being in any sort of coalition that's seeking to counter anti-Semitism. And their inclusion makes me question whether this strategy will not only be effective, but was put forward just kind of in a performative matter instead of actually trying to counter anti-Semitism.
Yeah. So let me just give some context to why I think CARE was included. Not that I defend it in any way. I think it's outrageous. But when the White House announced that it was going to undertake such a strategy and it was looking into it, the American Muslim organizational establishment wanted in, and CARE is one of the leading forces in the American Muslim establishment and probably lobbied the administration hard and its various progressive allies in the administration hard. And the administration really did not want to undertake a second major effort on Islamophobia. So what they did, the administration told them, and they sort of indicated this publicly, I believe, that they would fold in Islamophobia into the anti-Semitism strategy. And I think this is sort of their concession to CARE. And so I took a look at that before the meeting. I went back and referenced it in the anti-Semitism strategy. And it basically says CARE will be tasked with going to houses of worship to talk about bigotry and the like. But it is arguably letting the fox in the hen house. And if you were to imagine that this came out of a Republican administration, someone quipped, it'd be like having Nick Fuentes go out and do some of the outreach. Whether that's at a stretch or not, I don't know. But I think the truth is that CARE was founded by very, very radical people who were actively involved in supporting terrorism against Israel. The White House and the FBI at various moments have declared CARE basically a supporter of terrorism, and FBI banned dealing with CARE for a long time. People will say, well, CARE changed, they evolved. Yeah, maybe they've evolved in certain places in certain ways. They've learned how to sort of work the system better. and I'm sure they've stifled a lot of their radical views publicly. But the same people who are in charge of CARE then are in charge of CARE now, and those are radical people. So I don't buy it. I don't buy that we're dealing with this moderate force in American politics. A lot of moderate Muslim Americans don't buy it. So I think it was a horrific decision on the part of the White House, really deeply troubling, as I think William Daroff of the Conference of Presidents said, to include them in this document.
So there are two things with that. One, any organization that is that weak and can't stand up to lobbying from a group that's known to actively spew anti-Semitic rhetoric doesn't leave me with much faith that they're going to effectively counter anti-Semitism. And the second part is that I'm sure CARE gets a lot of press. I'm sure they have a lot of funds. But to go, if your go-to Muslim organization is the radical one that actually tries to actively push out moderate Muslim groups from taking the mantle and speaking on behalf of American Muslims, that's also an issue. What it does is it legitimizes an organization that is extremist and silences the organizations that aren't, the Muslim organizations that aren't. There, we know a number of them. If there was the need or desire to have a Muslim organization take part in this strategy, I don't know why one of the moderate organizations that doesn't call for not only the destruction of Israel, but the destruction of the United States wouldn't be included. I think it shows a weakness, just one weakness of this strategy to effectively combat anti-Semitism. And the other part is okay, I understand maybe this White House didn't have the bandwidth to then have another initiative that addresses and counters Islamophobia, but you don't see any other group of people who've been targeted by bigotry and harassment and violence and threats like the Jewish community in the US has, have another group piggyback on a strategy to address all of those things that they're experiencing. So I don't see it as I don't see it in any way as a positive thing. I think it shows a bit of weakness.
Right. So there's sins of commission and sins of omission, right? The commission being, of course, the inclusion of the Nexus document framework on anti-Semitism, which waters down IRA in many ways. It actually explicitly states that anti-Zionism is not necessarily a form of anti-Semitism, and so therefore it can let off the hook a lot of the radicals that were actually the impetus behind the IRA definition in the first place. Let's remember that the reason why we had an IRA definition is that European countries primarily were not taking anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism seriously. There were these horrific protests in European countries that often targeted houses of worship with anti-Zionist rhetoric, and they were overlooked because the European policymakers didn't see those as categories of anti-Semitism. And I think that's a tremendous problem. And the IRA definition was meant to help resolve that. And here you have another definition competing against it. Now, I wrote a piece that came out in the Jewish Journal. Dan, perhaps you could link to it. Do Jews get to define anti-Semitism? And I say yes and no. Yes, that we get to have a major say, you would think, in how governments define anti-Semitism, and governments need to be able to define anti-Semitism if they're going to counter it. No, we don't get to tell everybody else what to think. We'll return to that in a second. But one of the things I argue is that, listen, it's okay for people, the Nexus people who supported the Nexus definition, to have their say. We live in an open society. They get to lobby. But it's also okay for the IRA people and the mainstream Jewish community to say, I'm sorry, but we oppose that definition. We don't want it in there. And I think the White House must have been trying to sort of, I think they upheld ultimately the IRA definition as the defining framework, but they were sort of nodding to the Nexus people. And the concern there is that makes it harder for groups to get European countries and Latin American countries and others to wholeheartedly endorse the IRA definition, because now we've sort of diluted it a bit with the Nexus definition.
No, I agree. I think that if there's going to be a strategy that's supposed to address any issue that we're seeing in wider society, the first steps that you take shouldn't neuter that strategy. And unfortunately, I think that's what the White House did with the inclusion of Nexus. I think it's a neutering of before they even get started. with their strategy before they've started rolling anything out.
Right. So we've talked about the two sins of commission, the nexus, the inclusion of care in this. The sins of omission, arguably, might be that they didn't spend enough time. I'm not surprised, by the way, but they didn't spend enough time talking about ideological anti-Semitism coming from the left, which is really what we're in the business of addressing as an organization. What do you make of that? They did address it, though, right? It's in the campus conversation. They did address it.
Slightly. I think that if we were to actually look at the incidents of anti-Semitism that have been recorded and documented by mainstream organizations, by the FBI, we would look and see where those occur. The prominence given to right-wing anti-Semitism coming from, white supremacist elements, is highlighted so much that it makes it appear as though that's where the way most Jews in America experience anti-Semitism. And I argue it's not. When you look at what's happening on university campuses, there aren't many neo-Nazis that are marching through university campuses with swastika flags. There are, however, Islamists and their supporters marching through college campuses and university campuses in the United States, calling for the destruction of the Jewish people and Jewish self-determination. So not highlighting that, not giving it enough weight and heft, also to me shows a bit of a weak strategy.
Yeah, about a year ago, I spoke at a National Jewish Student Conference, and I love to do polling. Okay, so I usually pose these polling questions on a big PowerPoint screen, and people can do live polling with their phones. I'm sure you've all done that before. And I posed the question, where do you see most anti-Semitism coming from, the left or the right? And these are Jewish students. These are not necessarily politically conservative Jewish students. And it was overwhelming, like 80% said from the left, because that's how young Jews experience anti-Semitism on campus. They don't experience it by and large from some neo-Nazi, running around or threatening them. They experience it from very fierce anti-Zionists who are trying to disenfranchise them. And that's how, in some ways, anti-Semitism on the right and the left tend to express themselves differently. Like, we're worried that anti-Semitism on the right is violent. I mean, I think we're more likely to see a neo-Nazi run into a synagogue, as we've seen before, and shoot up people than we are an anti-Zionist or an anti-fascist type. I'm not saying couldn't happen. You could get it from the Muslim world, and we have seen that as well. But I wouldn't put that in the same category as left-wing anti-Semitism. I think it's a distinct expression. So it can be more violent, and a lot of the security costs that have come with right-wing anti-Semitism are due to neo-Nazi groups that are threatening us, and that's a huge problem for the Jewish community. It makes it so we feel like we're scared to go to the synagogue or send our kids to the JCC or whatever. That said, I think you're 100% right. The disenfranchisement comes from the left.
Yeah, there's a normalization that happens. And I mean, I'm in Pennsylvania, the other side of the state right now. The trial just started for the murderer of the victims of the Tree of Life shooting. It just started this week. I'm not in no way trying to minimize the dangers and threats that come from white supremacists as far as anti-Semitism. I think that if we were really gonna look at it, I suspect what we would see is that white supremacists, neo-Nazis pose a more dangerous, violent threat to Jewish institutions. And most Jewish individuals are experiencing anti-Semitism coming from the left or from Islamists or other groups.
Right. Agreed. So I said that we'd return to the subject of this opinion piece that I just wrote. I said, the title was, do Jews get to define anti-Semitism? And I answered yes and no. It's been part of an ongoing argument that Brandy and I have having. I may have actually sort of modified my view in a way by saying, yes, we do in certain instances. So I'm not sure if you still share the same opposition that you might have before. So here's my argument. My argument is, of course, Jews have a role to play in the official definitions of anti-Semitism. It affects us. We monitor it closely. We have a lot of experience. Lived experience does matter, even though I sometimes argue that it shouldn't be used as the sole data point, but it does matter. Jews are experiencing the anti-Semitism both on the left and the right. And I would think that the governments that are trying to help us, thankfully, would want to listen to our experiences and want to factor in what we think are the definitions. Now, obviously, Jews are diverse and there are different views on what it should be, but there is a relatively strong consensus position. I mean, overwhelmingly, Jewish institutions support the IRA definition. So I see no reason why that shouldn't be given its pride of place in governments, and that we shouldn't wholeheartedly endorse. We shouldn't wholeheartedly endorse it, and they shouldn't factor that in the way that they define it. And so I think we're playing a very constructive role. That said, and this is me trying to be very consistent about my critique of woke ideology, and that is that that doesn't mean that Jews get sort of a unilateral voice to define it for the rest of society, and everybody else sort of must yield to our position. Because if we say that, then other groups that claim to be representing, elements in the Black community can say you must accept the definition that racism equals prejudice plus power. We're stuck with everybody else's definitions as well. We're stuck with CARE's definition of Islamophobia. And because I'm not willing to defer to anybody else on anything, quite frankly, maybe to you once in a while, but other than that, I'm not willing to defer. I'm a free citizen. I'm going to express my view. I don't want to be bound by that discourse that everybody must defer to everybody else's lived experience of oppression. And so therefore, I don't think we can make that claim for the rest of society. That's my argument. Am I wrong?
Slightly. No. So I think that Jews get to define anti-Semitism, and other people are welcome to have an opinion on it. And that they're welcome to have an opinion that differs from the definition that most Jewish people give defining anti-Semitism. And the reason I say that is because I strongly believe that there are sometimes things that lived experience actually give people a better idea, or give them a little bit more knowledge on. So if I experience something and I say that this is sexism, you may understand it but not really get it unless we actually have a conversation on, oh, this is why she said that, because
Right.
as a woman. If my in-laws came to the United States from the Soviet Union, they have accents. When they experience and have experienced xenophobia, I could easily brush it off. Oh, no, that's not what it is. But if they have, no, this is why I say it, because this has happened before, and this is what it led to, and this is why, and this is ideology, then I'm going to take their experience with that and actually accept it a little bit more, because they've lived it and they've kind of walked in that position. There's a whole idea of, you can't judge someone until you walk 2 moons in their shoes. And the idea of that isn't that lived experience trumps knowledge. It's that it does sometimes give people a better understanding of a very specific event.
Yeah, it's a form of knowledge, by the way. Lived experience is a form of knowledge. It's not the only form of knowledge. So I think I owe it to you and to society and to myself to hear you out on what it's like as a woman to experience sexism. I think I have an obligation to, because I know that I don't have access to that same experience. I also, though, don't necessarily have to defer to you. So people say, well, it's rampant, and in fact, there are women's group, for example, who say that it explains why there's a differential in earnings. And if I see data that says, well, actually, it's because women might be out of the workplace for longer than men because of maternity leave and the like, or because they're taking on different professions than men by and large. And so if you average that all out, women are being paid less, not because there's discrimination, or maybe there is discrimination, but it doesn't explain everything. I have to have that independent ability to question that as well. So I might say, okay, you're experiencing sexism in a very specific way. I had to hear that out, and maybe I'll learn something. I'm sure I would, but I also need to maintain my independence of thought, even given your expression of lived experience. So it doesn't become illiberal. So I think that a non-Jew or non-Jewish society or governments or anybody else has an obligation to listen to the Jewish experience with anti-Semitism. But I don't think anybody gets the last word on anything. I want to always maintain my ability to push back. And so I would love everybody to say, listen, you're Jewish. You should defer to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. You shouldn't question it and let that become the dominant view of society. I mean, that would be lovely. But if I actually expect everybody to sort of yield to me on that, how can I then not yield to them when they're making the same demands?
No, I think I agree. I agree with you on that. And I think IRA is actually a really great example, because what you'll hear from people who don't support IRA, their main critique is that, well, IRA would criminalize or make it illegal to critique Israel. And so in their view, anti-Zionism doesn't equal anti-Semitism. Well, the conversation needs to go deeper than that, because one, IRA allows and actually encourages open critique of any state, Israel included. And
Right.
Zionism doesn't mean openly supporting every single government in
Sure.
the state of Israel. So there are those, without that conversation, the misunderstandings wouldn't be able to be cleared up. And I think that that's necessary. That's the critique I hear. Actually, probably the only critique I hear about IRA, and it's wrong. It's based in, if we're not allowed to disagree and have those conversations, and only defer, then the correction of that misunderstanding wouldn't happen.
Exactly. Such a good point. Exactly. Right. And and I just don't think it's reasonable. It doesn't mean that an anti-Zionist is not an anti-Semite. It can mean that, and probably usually is true. But what I don't want to happen is, and this is where I think it can cross into liberalism on the part of certain activists in our own community. If they say you're an anti-Semite because you don't embrace IRA, that's shutting the conversation down. That's what or you're somehow engaging in illegitimate discourse. I totally disagree with the people who are pushing the nexus definition. I totally disagree with them, but I'm not going to try to delegitimize them or marginalize them from the conversation, because now I want to win in the court of public opinion, and I want to win at the government, and I think I have every right to push hard for the IRA definition in the government and try to get the government to say, I'm sorry, but the IRA definition is the dominant one, and that's the one we're going with. I think we're probably pretty close on this. I want to make sure we don't pay short shrift though to the opposition. So I sent out my article yesterday, and I got an email. I'm not going to cite his name because I'm not. I want him to be able to offer his own opinion. Maybe we'll bring him on the podcast. He said, "Good article, but wrong. Men don't get to define sexism, whites racism, or straights homophobia. You may find this illiberal, but it's the reality. It's actually quite liberal to insist that Jews are treated as the same as others. If Jews don't have the authority to define anti-Semitism, then you're allowing anti-Semites to do it, which is what they prefer, so they can never be accused of bigotry. Nexus and JDA just twist definition to exclude their personal views." So what he's basically arguing, and it's hard to resist this, I have to say, is that, look, okay, you might find this illiberal, but everybody else is doing it. If we're not doing it too, then we're just left out, and we're allowing somebody else to define us. What do you think?
One, I think the idea for his examples are bad. So to say that men don't get to define sexism means that men never experience it. We know that's not true. To say that white people can't define racism, then that's the assumption that white people have never experienced racism. Again, not true. And that's where, okay, lived experience counts, but so does the data. And the data shows otherwise. So I don't think, the examples to me are just bad. I think that there are easy ways to have clear definitions for what words are. So defining what anti-Semitism means, there are clear definitions and markers to that. And I don't think that there's another definition that has come close to perfect as the IRA definition. Right. And not just for defining anti-Semitism historically, but defining contemporary anti-Semitism, how many Jews in the United States and other places are actually experiencing it.
Right. But see, I think his argument, and this comes from somebody who's center right, is very akin actually to the center left people who are sort of working within the framework of ethnic studies. They're saying, listen, we can't control the larger societal framework around DEI, around diversity. And if you can't beat them, join them. So go get your piece of the action. So yes, you don't like the idea that they're characterizing America as an oppressive country and that it's rampant. Okay, I agree, 100%. It's overstating it. It's not. It's illiberal, but we better get our piece of the action, or we're going. If, as they say, if you're not at the table, then you're lunch, and we're going to be lunch. That's what they're arguing. I mean, I've been making those arguments for many, many years. That like, look, we don't always like what the fundamental social dominant view is, but if we don't play within ball with it, we're going to lose out. And yet, I've had a change of heart on this because I think that framework in ethnic studies is so noxious, so dangerous that it will produce anti-Semitism anyway. And I worry that my friend here who wrote this lovely missive to me is wrong in that by giving into it and by giving into that, what you might call epistemology, by giving into that idea that groups get to define the oppression against themselves, I mean, we're locked into a really, really bad situation if we stipulate to that.
I agree. I think also that the idea that we can't change it is wrong. That's a losing strategy. And maybe I'm just also, an oppositional Gen Xer, but I don't think participating in a bad game to be the winner in a bad game is the way to go. I think that you actually, change the rules or work to.
Yeah, I think we have to change the rules. I think it's changeable. I think societies change. I think culture changes. I think ideas change. I think ideologies change. And I don't know why we would be so quick to give into a narrative that's so inimical to our own interests and our own experience as a community. And I feel like if I did stipulate that only groups that experience oppression get to define it, I'm sort of being inauthentic and illiberal, and I'm not willing to do that. And I think that's a violation of Jewish values and American values. So I guess back to the topic at hand, will the White House's new strategy effectively combat anti-Semitism? I think the answer is it can. And by the way, maybe it affords opportunities to ratchet up their engagement on left-wing anti-Semitism.
I think that'd be fantastic. I think there are opportunities to see. This is, to me, the first step in a very long overdue acknowledgement and strategy to combat anti-Semitism. And I think that if it's going to work, then the people that are combating anti-Semitism actually have to look at anti-Semitism that comes from all directions, not just one. And obviously, we're in a good position to be able to do that.
Exactly. Well, let's give it a shot. All right. Well, thanks, Brandy.
Thanks,
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.